The year was 1917, and across the wide, restless Atlantic, the sound of thunder was not the sound of storms but of artillery. Europe had become a vast breathing wound, trenches stretching like veins across the earth, soaked with rain, fear, and the heavy breath of dying men. For 3 long years, America had watched from a distance, safe behind her oceans, pretending that geography could protect innocence. But even oceans could not silence the echo of cannon fire or the whispers of ambition that crossed the waves. In small American towns, the war felt like a story told in newspapers. Foreign names, distant kings, and impossible maps. Mothers poured coffee at dawn and spoke in hushed voices about sons who might be called to fight. Farmers turned up the soil while European fields turned red. And somewhere in the marble halls of Washington, President Woodrow Wilson sat awake under lamplight, trying to decide whether America's soul was meant to stay silent or to speak with gunfire. When the First World War began in 1914, the United States was a young giant, rich in resources and confident in its detachment. Wilson had promised peace. He believed that America, if she kept her hands clean, could teach the old world something new: reason, restraint, and democracy. But neutrality is a fragile thing. It is like glass in a storm, and soon cracks began to appear. Ships carrying food and steel to Europe began to vanish beneath the waves. Letters from London spoke of blockades and hunger, while Berlin warned of spies and secret weapons. The British needed supplies, and America had plenty to sell. Factories in New York and Philadelphia clanged day and night, filling the holds of merchant ships with rifles, shells, and boots. Gold flowed across the ocean, and with it something invisible but powerful: allegiance. President Wilson still spoke of peace, but the world was shifting beneath him. When the British stopped German ships, America protested softly. When German submarines began sinking British liners, the protests grew louder. And then came the Lusitania, a great passenger ship struck without warning, broken in half by a German torpedo. 1,200 souls sank into the cold Atlantic that day, and among them 128 Americans. The water swallowed them whole, and with them it began to swallow America's neutrality. Across the country, anger rippled like a storm wind. Newspapers printed words like murder and outrage. Children in classrooms learned to hate the word Hun. In the heartland, German-American families, once proud of their heritage, painted over their signs, changed their names, and prayed that no one would ask them where their grandparents had been born. Still, President Wilson hesitated. He believed that America's duty was higher than revenge. He called it armed neutrality, a promise that America would defend her ships, but not seek war. But the ocean has a way of eroding promises. When American merchant vessels began to disappear, one after another, and when a coded message, the infamous Zimmermann telegram, revealed that Germany was courting Mexico with dreams of invading the United States, Wilson's patience broke. On April 6, 1917, Congress declared war on Germany. The sleeping giant had awakened. Factories thundered, fields emptied of young men, and ships carried them eastward toward a land of mud and misery they had never seen before. For the men who sailed over there, the world seemed both grand and uncertain. They came from farms and city blocks, from quiet valleys and bustling harbors. They carried letters, photographs, and the belief that this was not conquest but duty, that they were crossing the sea to end war itself. Among them was Captain Lloyd Belleau Williams of the 5th Marine Regiment, a man who would soon stand at the edge of Belleau Wood and speak 6 words that would become legend. Retreat? Hell, we just got here. Those words, shouted into the smoky chaos of battle, were not bravado. They were defiance. They were the sound of a nation discovering its own strength, not through victory, but through endurance. And so began the American chapter of the Great War, not written in marble or glory, but in mud, in fear, and in the quiet courage of men who... The first thing they noticed was the smell, a thick, earthy scent that clung to everything, a mix of pine needles, gunpowder, and something sour that no one wanted to name. Belleau Wood was not like the open fields of France. It was a tangle of trees, roots, and hidden shadows, where bullets seemed to whisper between branches and the line between man and forest began to blur. The Marines of the 5th and 6th Regiments stepped into that world, like men entering a cathedral of ghosts. It was June of 1918. The Germans had broken through French lines and were pushing toward Paris. Panic rippled through the ranks of their weary allies, men who had fought since 1914 and had nothing left but fear and fatigue. When the Americans arrived, they were strangers, loud, confident, untested. They wore new uniforms that still smelled of wool, carried rifles that shone under the faint sunlight, and spoke in an accent that sounded foreign even to their friends. The French commander tried to explain that a retreat was necessary, his face pale with exhaustion, his eyes hollow from weeks without rest. Captain Lloyd Williams listened, his boots half buried in the mud, his hands on his rifle, and after a moment, with the quiet stubbornness of a man who has made peace with death, he said those words that would ripple through history. Retreat, hell, we just got here. It wasn't said with fury. It was said with finality, a calm challenge to fate itself, the kind of words that are not shouted but remembered, because they are spoken by men who no longer plan to turn back. When the fighting began, the air filled with the scream of artillery shells and the low mechanical rhythm of machine gun fire. Trees splintered into dust, the ground shook as if the forest itself were breathing, and the sky turned grey with powder. The Marines advanced anyway, one slow step at a time, crawling over the dead, pressing forward through barbed wire and cratered earth. They had been told this would be a quick fight, that the Germans were retreating, but the woods were alive with resistance. Machine gun nests waited behind fallen logs, and every opening in the trees was a trap. The enemy was invisible, but his bullets were not. Private Thomas Holcomb later wrote that the noise never stopped, not even for a breath. It was as if the entire forest had become a single, endless explosion. And yet, amidst that noise, there was a strange kind of silence. The silence that exists inside a man when he realizes that every step forward might be his last, and he takes it anyway. The Americans fought for days, measuring progress in yards, not miles. Every tree seemed to have its own story, carved by shrapnel, marked by blood, burned black by fire. They fought through poison gas, through hunger, through thirst. Their canteens were empty, their rations gone, but still they advanced. At night, when the gunfire quieted, the men would sit with their backs against the trees and listen to the wounded cry out between the roots. In those long, breathless nights, they began to understand something profound, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the quiet decision to keep going while fear walks beside you. They whispered prayers, shared cigarettes, and passed canteens of muddy water as if they were holy relics. Some wrote letters they knew would never be sent. Others stared at the stars through the canopy, trying to remember what silence used to sound like. By the 7th day, Belleau Wood was no longer a forest. It was a graveyard, the smell of cordite mixed with the sweet, sickly scent of decay. But the line held, against artillery, against gas, against the endless waves of German assaults. The Marines did not break. And when the counterattack came, when the Germans tried to reclaim what they had lost, they met not frightened recruits, but hardened soldiers who had seen too much to ever be afraid again. The Marines charged with bayonets fixed, shouting through the haze, and drove the enemy back step by step, clearing the woods in brutal close combat that lasted until the sun fell, and the air itself seemed tired of war. When it was finally over, the silence returned, heavy, sacred, unbearable. Belleau Wood was quiet again, but nothing in it was alive. The trees stood broken like monuments, the earth torn open, and among it all the bodies of men who had come as strangers and left as legends. For the United States, this was more than a battle, it was an awakening. The world had seen the Americans fight, and they had seen them bleed. From that moment on, the name Marine would carry a weight that no enemy could ignore. And yet in that triumph, there was no celebration. The men of Belleau Wood didn't sing, didn't cheer. They simply sat in the dirt, staring at the trees, knowing that the forest would never leave them. That in some quiet way a part of them would always remain there, among the roots, in the shadow of the woods that had almost swallowed them whole. When autumn came to France in 1918, the fields turned brown, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and rot. It was the kind of season that belonged to ghosts, the wind low, the trees thinning, and the roads crowded with endless columns of men who looked more like memories than soldiers. The Americans had been fighting for over a year now, and though their uniforms were still new, their faces were old. The bright confidence that had crossed the Atlantic with them had been worn away by mud, fear, and the terrible familiarity of death. The Meuse-Argonne offensive began before sunrise on September 26. It was the largest and bloodiest operation the American army had ever attempted. Over 1 million soldiers, farm boys from Kansas, machinists from Chicago, lumbermen from Oregon, and immigrants who still struggled with English, stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the signal that would send them forward into the grey mist. Somewhere at the front, General John J. Pershing watched the horizon from a small rise in the terrain. He was a tall, stern man, a figure carved from old discipline, the kind of officer who carried his authority like armor. But even he knew that what lay ahead was beyond command, beyond planning. The land itself was an enemy, a maze of trenches, wire, pillboxes, and shell holes filled with black water. When the artillery began, it was like the world had decided to end. The sky flashed white for miles, the earth shook until it felt alive, and the sound rolled endlessly, so loud that it no longer seemed like sound at all, but a deep vibration that settled in the bones. For 6 hours the guns fired without pause. Then, as the last barrage faded, the Americans began to move. The mud was knee-deep, the fog thick enough to hide entire battalions, and the air was cut by the hiss of machine guns. Men stumbled forward, slipping on bodies, choking on gas, shouting for comrades they could no longer see. And yet, in that chaos, something remarkable happened. The line did not break. Units that had never fought together held fast. Small groups of men dug in and refused to fall back, and every inch of progress was paid for in blood and breath. In one ravine, Corporal Alvin York, a quiet man from the Tennessee mountains who had once sworn never to kill, found himself surrounded by the impossible. Caught in machine gun fire, he crawled through the mud, his rifle clutched like a piece of fate itself, and when it was over, 25 Germans lay dead, and 132 had surrendered. York never spoke of glory. He said only that he did what had to be done. Farther north, the Harlem Hellfighters, an African-American regiment loaned to the French army, fought with a fury that would echo for generations. They had been denied equal treatment at home, but in the trenches, they were equals to any man alive. When they advanced, they sang, not from joy, but from defiance, their deep voices rolling through the fog like thunder in the distance. The Meuse-Argonne was not a single battle, but a long, endless struggle, fought day and night through forests that devoured men and villages that no longer existed by morning. The smell of wet gunpowder mixed with the sweetness of crushed apples from abandoned orchards. Soldiers slept standing up, their eyes open, their minds drifting somewhere between dream and exhaustion. Letters from home arrived soaked in mud, some never arrived at all. Still, the Americans pushed forward. Slowly, painfully, the German lines began to crumble. The enemy, once fierce and certain, now looked hollow-eyed and starved. The mighty machine that had begun the war was rusting from the inside. And when the end finally came, when word spread that an armistice had been signed, the news arrived not with cheering but with silence. At 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918, the guns stopped. The sudden quiet was almost unbearable. Men who had learned to live with the sound of death now flinched at the sound of their own heartbeat. Across the front, soldiers lifted their heads, stared into the pale November sky, and tried to understand what it meant to be alive when so many were not. In the days that followed, they wandered the ruins like ghosts returning to their own graves. The towns were gone, the forests shredded, the rivers clogged with debris, but there was a strange beauty in it too. The way the frost settled on the torn earth, the way the sunlight returned timidly through the smoke, as if the world itself was trying to remember how to be gentle again. When the surviving Americans finally marched home, they came not as heroes in parades, but as quiet men who carried something unspoken in their eyes. They had crossed an ocean to fight a war that was supposed to end all wars. Instead, they had learned that there is no such thing as the end of suffering, only pauses between its chapters. Back home, the cities cheered, the flags waved, and the bands played over there, but the soldiers stood still, their minds somewhere else, still hearing the guns, still smelling the cordite, still dreaming of the men they left behind in Belleau Wood, in the Argonne, in the mud that seemed to stretch forever. When the war ended, the silence felt heavier than the gunfire ever had. Europe was a cemetery with borders, a land of broken stones and broken people. In the shattered streets of Verdun and Reims, children played among ruins that still smelled of smoke, and farmers returned to fields where the harvest had long since turned to dust. The world had survived, but it had forgotten how to live. In that fragile calm, President Woodrow Wilson crossed the Atlantic, not as a politician, but as a pilgrim. He believed the war had been a moral crusade, a punishment meant to purify humanity and to teach nations that peace was not simply the absence of fighting, but a new order built on reason and justice. The newspapers called him the prophet of peace, and when his ship arrived in France, the crowds filled the docks like a tide. Women threw flowers from balconies, children waved small flags, and soldiers, French, British, and even some German prisoners, stood in stunned silence as the American president stepped ashore. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the world believed in him. The people of Europe, weary and half-starved, saw in Wilson something they had not seen in years: hope. He spoke softly, but with conviction, outlining his vision, the famous 14 points. A plan for a world where wars could be prevented by law, where nations would speak instead of strike, where borders would be drawn by the consent of those who lived behind them. It was an impossible dream, but dreams are all that remain after so much death. Inside the cold, echoing rooms of the Palace of Versailles, where mirrors reflected both grandeur and guilt, Wilson sat across from the victors of the Old World. Clemenceau of France, sharp-eyed and bitter, demanded punishment. Lloyd George of Britain, calculating and weary, sought balance between revenge and reason. Wilson spoke of forgiveness, of rebuilding rather than dividing, but forgiveness is hard to sell in a room full of ghosts. The French wanted security, the British wanted their empire restored, and the Americans, who had bled far less, wanted to go home. Slowly, inevitably, the dream began to crumble. The treaty that emerged from those endless talks was not the gentle peace Wilson had promised. It was an accounting, a list of debts, reparations, and grievances carved into paper. Germany was broken on paper as thoroughly as it had been on the battlefield, and though the ink was black, the consequences were red. Still, Wilson clung to one idea that survived the bargaining table: the League of Nations, a gathering of nations that would in theory prevent another war by talking before fighting. It was to be the conscience of humanity, a meeting place for reason in a world too accustomed to chaos. When Wilson returned home, he believed that this would be America's gift to the world, a new moral compass forged in the fire of war. But home was no longer the same country he had left behind. The cheering parades had faded. The soldiers had come home silent, their uniforms worn, and their hearts somewhere far away. The factories had slowed, the debt had risen, and families waited for sons who would never walk through the door again. The word Europe had become sour on the tongue. People were tired of sacrifice, tired of idealism, tired of bleeding for foreign soil. When Wilson presented the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations to Congress, he expected pride. What he met instead was resistance. America, it seemed, wanted no part of Europe's endless mourning. Senators argued that entangling the country in foreign affairs would be a betrayal of the nation's founding promise, that it would mean trading peace for politics, freedom for obligation. As debates grew louder, Wilson's health began to fail. He toured the country by train, standing on platforms in the cold, his voice trembling with passion and exhaustion, trying to convince Americans that peace was worth fighting for. Crowds cheered him, but their applause was thin, their hearts already turned inward. In October of 1919, weakened and worn, the president collapsed from a stroke. He would never truly recover. The Senate rejected the treaty. The League of Nations was born without the nation that had dreamed it. And just like that, America turned away, back to its own shores, its own concerns, its own fragile sense of safety. In classrooms, history teachers spoke of victory, but the soldiers who had seen Belleau Wood and the Meuse Argonne said little. They found work where they could, married, raised families, and rarely spoke of France again. In time, their children would grow up hearing stories of glory, not of horror. The parades would fade into sepia photographs, and the memory of the Great War would become something distant. A story whispered by old men in fading uniforms, on porches where the wind carried the sound of trains heading nowhere. But history never sleeps. Beneath the peace of the 1920s, something darker was already stirring: resentment, hunger, and a silence filled with unfinished sentences. And though the world called it the war to end all wars, the truth was simpler, sadder, and older. No war ever truly ends. It only changes its shape, waiting for another generation to remember what their fathers had forgotten. The war had ended, but its echo lingered, not in the fields of France, but in the hearts of men who had returned from them. Across America, trains arrived one after another, releasing thin streams of uniformed figures onto platforms where mothers waited with trembling hands and wives held children who no longer recognized the faces before them. The bands played, the flags waved, and yet something was missing, a feeling that could not quite find its way back home. For those who had fought, peace was not a return to normality, but a kind of confusion. The silence felt unnatural. They had lived so long with the thunder of guns that the absence of it was almost unbearable. Some awoke at night, sweating, gripping their bedsheets as if they were rifles. Others stared out windows for hours, watching the wind move through the trees, waiting for a sound that never came. Doctors had a name for it: shell shock, but names have a way of shrinking what they cannot truly explain. In towns from Kansas to Connecticut, men drifted into bars and sat alone. They avoided each other's eyes, spoke little of what they had seen. When they did speak, it was in fragments: a laugh, a shudder, a sentence that trailed into silence. The young who had left America full of pride and purpose had come home with something that no parade could wash away: the knowledge that courage and survival were not the same thing. Some turned their pain into work. They built roads, started businesses, planted new crops on old land. Others, unable to find peace, wandered. The country was changing quickly now. New machines, new cities, the promise of the automobile and the radio. And those who had fought began to feel older than their years, relics of a time that no one wanted to remember too closely. The government spoke of progress, of prosperity, of a return to calm, but beneath the surface, there was a quiet fracture. The veterans' hospitals filled with men whose bodies and minds were broken in ways no doctor could mend. Opium and alcohol became silent companions. In the alleys of Chicago and the boarding houses of New York, veterans stared at photographs of their fallen friends and wondered if the world they had saved even noticed they were gone. In the South, black soldiers who had fought for France returned to a nation that refused to see them as equals. They had worn the uniform of freedom in Europe, only to find that it meant nothing in their own streets. Many spoke of the bitter irony. They had fought for democracy abroad, but had not yet found it at home. Out of that injustice would rise a new kind of courage, one that marched not with rifles but with words and determination. The seeds of civil rights were sown quietly, watered by the same sorrow that had drenched the trenches. Meanwhile, in drawing rooms and on university campuses, A new generation began to question the old world entirely. Writers and poets, men like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and John Dos Passos, tried to make sense of the senseless. They called themselves the Lost Generation, not out of despair, but because they had seen too much to believe in simple truths again. Their stories were full of drifting men and fading dreams, of love that could not last, and ideals that could not survive the weight of reality. In music halls, the sorrow turned to rhythm. Jazz began to bloom, wild, spontaneous, alive. It was as if the country needed to dance to forget. Trumpets and saxophones filled the night with something reckless and human, a defiance of silence. In that sound you could almost hear the echo of marching boots turned into syncopation, of battlefield chaos transformed into freedom. President Wilson, once the voice of moral idealism, spent his final years in isolation. The world had not accepted his dream, and America had moved on without him. He died quietly in 1924, his vision of lasting peace already fading into history's long shadow. But for the men who had walked through Belleau Wood, for those who had crossed the Meuse and watched the world end one more time at dawn, the war never truly ended. It lived on in their memories, in the weight of medals tucked into drawers, in the silence of empty chairs at dinner tables, in the way they flinched when thunder rolled across the plains. And so America stepped into a new age, richer, stronger, louder, but also more uncertain. Beneath the shine of the roaring 20s, beneath the neon and the laughter, there was a ghostly undertone, a kind of whisper that reminded the living of what it had cost to survive. For though the Great War had been won, something quieter and more elusive had been lost, the innocence of believing that humanity could ever truly learn from its own pain. The 1920s came like a breath of relief, a decade dressed in gold and noise, a desperate celebration meant to drown the memory of mud and death. Cities glowed with electric light, jazz spilled from hidden bars, and the streets were full of fast cars and faster dreams. It was as if the entire nation had decided that forgetting was the only way forward, that if they laughed loud enough, danced long enough, and built high enough, the ghosts would finally stop whispering. Factories roared, fortunes were made, and the word modern became a kind of prayer. Airplanes crossed the sky like silver birds, radios brought distant voices into quiet kitchens, and the ticker tape of Wall Street promised that the future would be endless and kind. America believed that it had left behind the old world's tragedies, that war was a European disease, and the new century belonged to her. But beneath the surface, the old wounds still pulsed. Veterans walked among the crowds, unrecognized, their medals pawned for bread. In small towns, the parents of the dead still kept rooms untouched, uniforms hanging in closets that would never be opened again. And while the cities grew taller, the farms grew poorer. The soil, once rich, was being stripped by greed and overuse. The country's wealth rose like a wave, but it was hollow, a glittering illusion that could not last. In Europe, the peace Wilson had dreamed of was unraveling. Germany staggered under the weight of the Treaty of Versailles, its currency collapsing, its people starving, its pride humiliated. In Italy, angry veterans marched beneath black banners, led by a man named Mussolini, who promised to restore glory to a wounded nation. Across the continent, bitterness became a kind of religion. The world had been promised peace, but what it received instead was silence, the kind that always comes before thunder. Back in America, the silence took another form. The jazz grew louder, the stock prices higher, and the newspapers filled with stories of record profits. Banks lent money freely. Men who had never seen Europe now speculated on its future. The dream of endless prosperity blinded almost everyone, even those who should have known better. No one wanted to remember that the last time the world had felt this confident, it had ended in trenches. And then, in the autumn of 1929, the illusion cracked. The market fell like a building collapsing under its own arrogance. Fortunes vanished overnight, banks failed, and the proud faces of Wall Street turned pale with disbelief. The roaring twenties ended not with applause but with a dull, endless silence. Bread lines replaced ticker tape. Men who once owned factories now waited for soup. The laughter of jazz faded into the echo of footsteps in empty streets. The Great Depression had arrived, and with it, the illusion that the world had changed after the war was gone. The same fears, the same anger, the same desperate search for someone to blame began to rise again. In Germany, a new voice began to echo, low at first, then louder. It came from beer halls and crowded rallies, from a man who promised to erase humiliation and restore honor. His words were sharp and dangerous, his uniform crisp, his anger convincing. The world barely noticed him at first. After all, he was only shouting what many already felt, but were too ashamed to say. But words have power, and when spoken into hunger, they can ignite. By the early 1930s, the smoke of the next storm was already visible on the horizon. America watched from across the ocean, tired, cautious, unwilling to intervene. Never again, they said. The words a fragile shield against a past that was already returning. Isolationism returned like an old friend, whispering that distance meant safety, that oceans could still protect innocence. But history, as it always does, was waiting to remind them that no ocean is wide enough to keep out the consequences of forgetting. The men who had survived the Great War, now grey and stooped, saw it coming before anyone else. They read the headlines, heard the speeches, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with age. They had already seen what happens when nations confuse pride for destiny. They had seen fields turn to graves and boys turn to numbers, and though they could not stop it, they knew that the world was beginning to circle back toward the same abyss they had once crawled out of. The echo of their footsteps in the mud of 1918 was faint now, almost gone, but if you listened closely, very closely, you could still hear it beneath the noise of the new age. It was the sound of a warning, carried through time, whispered by the ghosts of Belleau Wood and the Meuse Argonne, by the faces in old photographs and the empty helmets left behind in France. The Great War had ended, but history had only paused to catch its breath. The decade opened like a window after a storm, with curtains lifting in a thin breeze and dust swirling in a pale shaft of sunlight. And America, weary of mourning yet unwilling to confess it, began to dress its memories in gentler fabric, smoothing the creases of grief with the slow, practical motions of daily life, as if the right sequence of mornings and evenings could coax the heart to believe that the terrible thing had happened to someone else in another century. In small towns the parades continued, bands stepping carefully down Main Street on Armistice Day, while schoolchildren waved paper flags with the solemn concentration of those who know they are part of something sacred. Yet even then the drums felt softer and the speeches shorter, and the names recited from little bronze plaques seemed to drift away on the cold air, as if the syllables themselves were tired of being heavy, while the wind crossed the courthouse lawn and made a faint ringing sound in the rope of the flagpole, a sound that old men recognized and did not name. Homes remade themselves as museums of tenderness, frames dusted and straightened, a photograph in uniform, lifted each Saturday from the mantel, and set back again with that small reverent tap that mothers made with 2 fingertips, and in kitchen drawers, folded into envelopes that smelled of attic wood and soap flakes. There were the letters that stopped mid-season, sentences ending on ordinary words, soon, bread, stars, which is perhaps why they were read again and again, for ordinary words make the most faithful altars. In the cities, forgetting wore a brighter coat. Neon arrived like a new alphabet for happiness. And in the newly humming theatres, handsome actors learned to cry for us in black and white, so that our own eyes could rest. And the radio, that patient box of voices, taught living rooms to arrange their chairs in listening circles, the announcer's calm cadence, promising that the world could be catalogued and narrated and delivered at the top of the hour, not as screams from a tree line, but as tidy paragraphs with music at the end. Textbooks, bound in sturdy cloth and smelling faintly of ink and floor wax, turned the war into maps and dates, a sensible procession of causes and effects where arrows moved across a page with admirable discipline. The mud was measured in centimeters of advance, and the terror was translated into terms that would occupy exactly 2 test questions. And somewhere between the caption and the margin, a child understood that the past could be managed if it were flattened enough to fit beneath a ruler. Men who had once slept in shell holes learned new languages, account ledgers, engine blueprints, the clean arithmetic of inventory, while the old language of duckboards and barrages remained locked behind the teeth, and in barber chairs and back pews they spoke instead about weather and crops, and the price of coal, subjects with edges that did not cut the hand, and they found that if they stacked enough quiet tasks end to end, mend the hinge, sweep the step, oil the gate, the day itself would become a kind of bridge over which the mind might cross without looking down. Factories shook themselves awake and whistled at dawn, and along the assembly lines a rhythm steadier than artillery took hold. Bolts tightened in a music of torque and repetition. The clang and hiss and ratchet made into a promise that the nation could be built forward out of steel instead of backward out of memory. And even though the noise was immense, it was, in its way, merciful, because it filled the spaces where recollection might have spoken. Yet the country, being human, could not forget completely, and so it negotiated. It allowed memory to live in designated rooms, marble halls with clean echo and wreaths at noon, tidy veterans' posts where the coffee was always strong and the stories always shorter than the silence between them, cemeteries in France where the grass was clipped so close that the white crosses seemed to be rising out of snow. Thus the wound was honoured, and by being honoured was kept at a distance, for reverence is also a kind of fence. On certain nights the fence failed. A train whistle in winter could sound precisely like the shell that had taken a friend, and a street lamp dying with a pop could make a man cover his head in a doorway without knowing why, and a mother shelling peas on a back step could, for half a minute, smell cordite instead of summer rain, and the peas would roll into the damp dust and she would sit very still, hands open in her lap, until the world returned to its proper name. There were widows who never remarried because some promises do not end when the signer does, and there were men who did remarry and spoke their vows with a careful gratitude that sounded like prayer, and there were children with their father's eyes staring out from a photograph on the dresser, learning the shape of love through the testimony of those who had survived it. And in each of these houses there was a drawer, and in each drawer there was a medal, bright as a kept secret. Sometimes the past arrived politely, printed on ticket stubs. Steamships carried pilgrim mothers across the Atlantic to walk the rows at St. Mihiel or the Meuse Argonne, slowly, letter by letter, finding the carved name that had been a cradle once. And on those fields the wind still travelled with the same old patience, and the larks did not apologize for their singing, for birds are licensed by God to forgive where people cannot, and the women folded their hands and stood so long that the horizon itself seemed to lean nearer to help them breathe. When prosperity stumbled and the market fell, forgetting changed its clothes again. Bread lines lengthened and men who knew how to march refused to beg, and on a summer's day in the capital, a great grey river of veterans came to make their case with dignity and tense, because the country they had served was now a ledger that could not find their names, and the city, startled by that many memories arriving at once, asked them to leave. Though the newspapers quarrelled about blame, the smoke that drifted over the Anacostia flats smelled to some like a far older fire, and in boarding houses that night, men who had not cried in France closed their eyes and failed at not remembering. Still, the nation did what nations do. It planted, it paved, it studied, it married, it elected and corrected, and in classrooms a new generation traced rivers and rail lines while their teachers, kind and efficient, spoke of alliances and armistice with a gentleness one uses for winter storms already past, and the boys stared out the window at a sky that looked perfectly harmless, and the girls practiced their signatures in the margins, loops steady as if the future were not a cliff that any century might fail to see. Hollywood learned to soften the edges, letting courage wear clean shirts and tragedy arrive with good lighting, because theatre seats are easier on the heart than trenches, and the audience, which had earned the right to be spared, allowed itself to be convinced that gallantry could be rehearsed and death could be neatly scored. And though some directors slipped truth like a thin blade between frames, most nights the pictures ended with the lights coming up and everybody clapping, which is one way to keep the room from turning into a field. And yet, under the bright awnings of the decade, beneath radios that hummed like friendly beehives and storefront windows where mannequins made happiness look tailor-made, there was a patience gathering, quiet as snowmelt in the dark roots of a hill, made of unresolved grief and unspent danger, and the old, uncorrected geometry of borders. And if you stood very still at evening, on a street with a single lamp, and listened not to the sound but to the pause after it, you could sense that time itself was drawing breath, as if preparing to speak again, in the voice history uses when it wishes to be obeyed. So the country slept, not foolishly but mercifully, trusting the oceans to stand guard and the clocks to keep their promises, while in attics the trunks stayed latched and in basements, the trunks stayed dry, and in hearts, the trunks stayed heavier than wood, and across the water the century, which had only learned how to pronounce the word peace, began, slowly, professionally, to practice its opposite, and the moon, which watches everything and reports to no one, climbed the same ladders of light it had climbed above Belleau Wood, and looked down upon rooftops that did not yet know they were listening. The decade opened like a window after a storm, with curtains lifting in a thin breeze and dust swirling in a pale shaft of sunlight. And America, weary of mourning yet unwilling to confess it, began to dress its memories in gentler fabric, smoothing the creases of grief with the slow, practical motions of daily life, as if the right sequence of mornings and evenings could coax the heart to believe that the terrible thing had happened to someone else in another century. In small towns, the parades continued, bands stepping carefully down Main Street on Armistice Day, while schoolchildren waved paper flags with the solemn concentration of those who know they are part of something sacred. Yet even then the drums felt softer and the speeches shorter, and the names recited from little bronze plaques seemed to drift away on the cold air, as if the syllables themselves were tired of being heavy, while the wind crossed the courthouse lawn and made a faint ringing sound in the rope of the flagpole, a sound that old men recognized and did not name. Homes remade themselves as museums of tenderness, frames dusted and straightened, a photograph in uniform lifted each Saturday from the mantel, and set back again with that small, reverent tap that mothers made with 2 fingertips, and in kitchen drawers, folded into envelopes that smelled of attic wood and soap flakes, there were the letters that stopped mid-season, sentences ending on ordinary words, soon, bread, stars, which is perhaps why they were read again and again, for ordinary words make the most faithful altars. In the cities, forgetting wore a brighter coat. Neon arrived like a new alphabet for happiness, and in the newly humming theatres, handsome actors learned to cry for us in black and white, so that our own eyes could rest, and the radio, that patient box of voices, taught living rooms to arrange their chairs in listening circles, the announcer's calm cadence promising that the world could be catalogued and narrated and delivered at the top of the hour, not as screams from a tree line but as tidy paragraphs with music at the end. Textbooks, bound in sturdy cloth and smelling faintly of ink and floor wax, turned the war into maps and dates, a sensible procession of causes and effects, where arrows moved across a page with admirable discipline. The mud was measured in centimeters of advance, and the terror was translated into terms that would occupy exactly 2 test questions, and somewhere between the caption and the margin, a child understood that the past could be managed if it were flattened enough to fit beneath a ruler. Men who had once slept in shell holes learned new languages, account ledgers, engine blueprints, the clean arithmetic of inventory, while the old language of duckboards and barrages remained locked behind the teeth, and in barber chairs and back pews they spoke instead about weather and crops and the price of coal, subjects with edges that did not cut the hand. And they found that if they stacked enough quiet tasks end to end, mend the hinge, sweep the step, oil the gate, The day itself would become a kind of bridge over which the mind might cross without looking down. Factories shook themselves awake and whistled at dawn, and along the assembly lines a rhythm steadier than artillery took hold. Bolts tightened in a music of torque and repetition. The clang and hiss and ratchet made into a promise that the nation could be built forward out of steel instead of backward out of memory. And even though the noise was immense, it was, in its way, merciful, because it filled the spaces where recollection might have spoken. Yet the country, being human, could not forget completely, and so it negotiated. It allowed memory to live in designated rooms, marble halls with clean echo and wreaths at noon, tidy veterans' posts where the coffee was always strong and the stories always shorter than the silence between them, cemeteries in France where the grass was clipped so close that the white crosses seemed to be rising out of snow. Thus the wound was honoured, and by being honoured was kept at a distance, for reverence is also a kind of fence. On certain nights the fence failed. A train whistle in winter could sound precisely like the shell that had taken a friend, and a street lamp dying with a pop could make a man cover his head in a doorway without knowing why, and a mother shelling peas on a back step could, for half a minute, smell cordite instead of summer rain, and the peas would roll into the damp dust and she would sit very still, hands open in her lap, until the world returned to its proper name. There were widows who never remarried because some promises do not end when the signer does, and there were men who did remarry and spoke their vows with a careful gratitude that sounded like prayer, and there were children with their father's eyes staring out from a photograph on the dresser, learning the shape of love through the testimony of those who had survived it. And in each of these houses there was a drawer, and in each drawer there was a medal, bright as a kept secret. Sometimes the past arrived politely, printed on ticket stubs. Steamships carried pilgrim mothers across the Atlantic to walk the rows at St. Mihiel or the Meuse Argonne, slowly, letter by letter, finding the carved name that had been a cradle once, and on those fields the wind still travelled with the same old patience, and the larks did not apologize for their singing, for birds are licensed by God to forgive where people cannot, and the women folded their hands and stood so long that the horizon itself seemed to lean nearer to help them breathe. When prosperity stumbled and the market fell, forgetting changed its clothes again. Bread lines lengthened and men who knew how to march refused to beg, and on a summer's day in the capital, a great grey river of veterans came to make their case with dignity and tense, because the country they had served was now a ledger that could not find their names, and the city, startled by that many memories arriving at once, asked them to leave, though the newspapers quarrelled about blame. The smoke that drifted over the Anacostia flats smelled to some like a far older fire, and in boarding houses that night, men who had not cried in France closed their eyes and failed at not remembering. Still, the nation did what nations do. It planted, it paved, it studied, it married, it elected and corrected. And in classrooms a new generation traced rivers and rail lines, while their teachers, kind and efficient, spoke of alliances and armistice with a gentleness one uses for winter storms already past, and the boys stared out the window at a sky that looked perfectly harmless, and the girls practiced their signatures in the margins, looped steady as if the future were not a cliff that any century might fail to see. Hollywood learned to soften the edges, letting courage wear clean shirts and tragedy arrive with good lighting, because theatre seats are easier on the heart than trenches, and the audience, which had earned the right to be spared, allowed itself to be convinced that gallantry could be rehearsed and death could be neatly scored, and though some directors slipped truth like a thin blade between frames, most nights the pictures ended with the lights coming up and everybody clapping, which is one way to keep the room from turning into a field. And yet, under the bright awnings of the decade, beneath radios that hummed like friendly beehives and storefront windows where mannequins made happiness look tailor-made, there was a patience gathering, quiet as snowmelt in the dark roots of a hill, made of unresolved grief and unspent danger, and the old uncorrected geometry of borders. And if you stood very still at evening on a street with a single lamp and listened not to the sound but to the pause after it, You could sense that time itself was drawing breath, as if preparing to speak again in the voice history uses when it wishes to be obeyed. So the country slept, not foolishly, but mercifully, trusting the oceans to stand guard and the clocks to keep their promises, while in attics the trunk stayed latched and in basements the trunk stayed dry and in hearts the trunk stayed heavier than wood, and across the water the century, which had only learned how to pronounce the word peace, began slowly professionally to practice its opposite, and the moon, which watches everything and reports to no one, climbed the same ladders of light it had climbed above Belleau Wood, and looked down upon rooftops that did not yet know they were listening. The past does not return in a straight line. It circles, it drifts, it waits in corners of memory until someone opens a door for air. By the early 1930s, America believed it had closed every door that led back to the war, yet through the smallest cracks, through the reels of film, the pages of novels, the dreams that came uninvited at 4 in the morning, the shadows began to find their way home again. At first, they came gently, disguised as art. In darkened movie houses, audiences watched stories that claimed to be love tales, but could not help filling their frames with fog and rain and the sound of boots on cobblestones. Directors who had once been soldiers built trenches out of plywood and called them sets, and when the lights went down, the actors carried rifles that made some men in the seats stiffen before they remembered that this was only light and shadow. The camera learned to look at faces the way war had looked at them, too close, too long, without mercy. In bookstores, new voices began to speak in sentences that stumbled like men waking from nightmares. Hemingway wrote of courage in tones stripped bare of adjectives, as if language itself had been burned clean by gunfire. Fitzgerald filled his pages with glitter and exhaustion, parties that felt like hangovers even before the champagne ran out. Readers did not always know what these stories were about, only that they left a taste of salt and iron behind, the way blood does when you bite your lip and pretend not to notice. Even music, which had once sworn loyalty to laughter, began to remember its minor keys. The trumpet's bright cry turned smoky in basement clubs. Somewhere between the second chorus and the third drink, a listener could feel the distance between joy and forgetting collapse into a single long note. And in the small hours when radio slept and streets emptied, the old soldiers dreamed again. They were not always on battlefields. Sometimes they were simply trying to cross a street that kept turning into mud, or listening for a train that never arrived, or hearing someone call their name from behind a curtain of smoke that would not lift. They woke quietly so as not to wake their wives, sat on the edge of the bed, rubbed their faces, and waited for the room to remember where it was. Overseas, the ghosts were less polite. In Germany, the crowds gathered in torchlight, chanting names older than reason, and a man with a small mustache and enormous certainty began to promise that the last war had been a mistake only because it had not gone far enough. In Italy, the veterans of another lost empire marched again beneath flags that flattered their wounds, and across Europe, factories that had once built tractors began to build tanks in the same buildings, as if steel itself had a memory for its first purpose. America read these reports with the curiosity one reserves for distant relatives, interested, sympathetic, but certain that the madness belonged to another bloodline. The newspapers printed photographs of rallies and uniforms. The captions said unrest, but the eyes in the photographs said practice. A few editors warned that history was beginning to rhyme, but rhymes, like rumors, are easy to ignore when the weather is good and business is better. In classrooms, the maps were still quiet. Teachers spoke of the Great War in the past tense, underlining the dates carefully, and the students took notes without noticing that the ink smelled faintly of smoke. In the evenings, fathers told their sons that the world was too sensible now to make the same mistake twice, and the sons, who had never seen the inside of a gas mask, nodded and believed them. The veterans' posts grew smaller each year. Chairs sat empty. The coffee cooled faster. The jokes repeated themselves more slowly. Sometimes a new young man would wander in, eager to hear stories, and the older men would glance at each other, unwilling to spoil him. They spoke instead of fishing, of the price of nails, of the latest election, and when the boy left, the silence that followed was heavier than before. It was in that silence that the next war began, not in declarations or invasions, but in the collective sigh of a generation that had learned to doubt its own warnings. The sound was quiet, like the soft closing of a trunk in an attic, but if you listened closely you could hear metal against metal, the latching of the past making itself secure. By the middle of the decade, Europe was a stage again, and the actors had begun rehearsing. The scripts were familiar: grievance, hunger, pride, revenge. The audience, an entire planet, pretended it did not recognize the lines. And across the ocean, America dreamed on, convinced that distance was the same as destiny, that the shadows on the wall were only tricks of the light, and not the beginning of another storm gathering beyond the frame. They called themselves lost, though none of them had truly disappeared. They were everywhere, on cafe terraces, in small hotel rooms that smelled of ink and rain, in the narrow Parisian streets, where morning light fell through the smoke like dust through memory. They had survived the war, and in surviving it had become a kind of question the world did not know how to answer. The guns had fallen silent, but silence is not peace, it is only the space where echoes live. These men and women carried those echoes inside them, soft as heartbeats, constant as guilt. They had grown up on promises of glory and sacrifice, and found only mud and paperwork and the strange, lonely fact of being alive when better men were not. They were not soldiers anymore, but they could not quite become citizens again. In New York, Chicago, London, and above all in Paris, they gathered like moths around the dim light of understanding. The cafes along the Boulevard du Montparnasse became their temporary homeland, ashtrays full, typewriters humming, laughter brittle but generous. They drank to remember and to forget, often both at once, and wrote about the space between those two impulses as if it were the only country left that made sense. Ernest Hemingway sat in the corner of the Closerie de Lillas, heavy coat buttoned, eyes steady as iron nails. His words were simple, stripped of sentiment as if language itself had been injured and was now learning to walk again. His characters hunted, drank, and loved without believing in any of it, because belief had been one of the first casualties of 1914. He wrote that courage was grace under pressure, and he said it without irony. The world believed him because he sounded like someone who had seen the opposite. Across the river, Fur Scott Fitzgerald was chasing a different ghost, the illusion that beauty might heal what war had broken. He wrote of parties so bright that they cast shadows long enough to reach the graves. His heroes tried to buy happiness in champagne and silk, but the bubbles burst, and the fabric tore, and the music always stopped before midnight. Beneath every glittering paragraph, there was a quiet sentence that smelled faintly of mud and regret. Their friend Gertrude Stein, steady and amused, called them a lost generation, and the name stuck, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. They were lost not in geography, but in time, born into an age that had promised certainty and delivered confusion. They did not hate the world, they simply did not believe it. Artists painted with angles and dissonance, trying to rearrange the visible world until it matched the fractured one inside their heads. Poets abandoned rhyme the way soldiers abandon illusions. Music twisted itself into new shapes. Jazz and blues improvisations that refused to march, melodies that remembered how to fall apart gracefully. To outsiders, they looked glamorous, free, reckless. They moved through Europe as if exile were a vocation, but freedom for them was not joy. It was survival dressed up in new clothes. They had escaped the trenches, only to discover that the true battlefield was memory, the daily, invisible labor of keeping the past from swallowing the present whole. They fell in love often and briefly, because permanence felt like arrogance. They crossed oceans with manuscripts in suitcases, chasing publishers, lovers, and the mirage of belonging. They spoke of art the way priests once spoke of God, with conviction trembling on the edge of disbelief. And when the conversation grew quiet, when the cafe emptied, When the night turned thin and the streets shone with last rain, they sat alone with their cigarettes, and the question none of them could answer: what do you do when the world ends, and you are the one left to describe it? Back in America, their books began to sell. Critics called them modern. Readers called them strange. Universities taught their sentences to students who had never heard gunfire, who admired their cool precision without hearing the tremor underneath. It was the great irony of the lost generation that in losing their faith they had given the rest of the world a new language for doubt. And yet, as the decade wore on, even they grew quiet. Hemingway moved to Spain to find a cleaner kind of violence. Fitzgerald went west, chasing stories that no longer believed in him. The cafes emptied, the lights dimmed, and the generation that had once sworn never to be still began to age. Their exile was no longer romantic, it was routine. But their words remained, waiting for anyone who would one day stand in a world broken again and wonder what to call the feeling of surviving history. They had already given it a name: loss, written softly, stretched across a page like the horizon after an explosion, beautiful, empty, and still smoking. The mothers did not march in parades. They moved through the years quietly, carrying absence the way others carried baskets of bread or folded laundry, something always at hand, familiar from use, invisible from a distance. Their sons had gone to war with songs and banners, and they had stood on porches waving until the wagons turned a corner. The sound of that moment never stopped echoing. In the mornings after armistice, when the world declared itself healed, they rose before dawn as they always had. They boiled water, fed hens, mended seams. The body continued because habit is stronger than grief, but the air around them had changed its weight. In kitchens and small-town parlours, conversations stumbled when someone mentioned a date, a letter, a name. Windows stayed open longer, as if the wind might bring back the right voice if given a chance. Some mothers received boxes, coffins, they were told, but often empty. The military sent papers with seals and signatures, proof that their boys had existed in uniform. The women placed those papers beside photographs, adjusted them each week to keep the frames straight, and in the quiet hours looked at them as one might study a map for a road that had ceased to exist. The government called them Gold Star Mothers. It offered pilgrimages across the ocean to visit graves neatly arranged in foreign soil. And so, dressed in black and carrying handbags that smelled faintly of talcum and hope, they boarded ships bound for France. On deck, the wind was sharp and salt-heavy, the same wind that had carried their sons east years before. They watched the water for days, and some whispered their children's names into it, not as prayers but as introductions, in case the sea still remembered. At the cemeteries they moved slowly among the rows, thousands of identical crosses, each one both theirs and not theirs. The earth was trimmed, the grass immaculate, as though the world had tried to apologize through neatness. Guides spoke in soft French-accented English about honor, sacrifice, duty. The mothers listened politely. They had long since learned that language fails where love begins. One woman knelt, pressing her gloved hand against the damp marble. She stayed that way for a long time, as if waiting for a heartbeat beneath the stone. Another took a small jar from her purse and scooped a handful of soil to carry home, a souvenir more honest than any medal. When the time came to leave, many looked back only once. The horizon of crosses seemed to follow them as they walked away. Back in America, life continued its practical insistence. The war memorials were unveiled, the flags raised, the speeches polished. The mothers stood among the crowds, faces composed, hands clasped. They clapped when others clapped. They understood ceremony, how it protected the living from the full voltage of loss. But in the evenings, when the noise dissolved and the streets emptied, they turned down their lamps and felt the silence settle like a shawl over their shoulders. They wrote letters that began with "Dear" and ended without address. They saved the local newspaper's armistice anniversary each year, folded into precise rectangles, as though repetition could make sense. They learned to measure time differently, not in seasons but in anniversaries of absence. Children grew up calling them strong, but strength was never the point. They had simply refused to stop loving someone who was gone, and love, when it has nowhere to go, becomes endurance. They tended gardens, baked bread for church socials, kept the world turning with quiet hands, because motion was the only rebellion left. Sometimes at dusk, a mother would hear the far whistle of a train, and for one impossible second imagine it was him returning, taller, older, apologetic. She would stand at the window until the sound faded, her hand on the sill, heart suspended between truth and memory. Then she would return to her chair, fold her hands again, and wait for the kettle to boil. In every town there was one house where the curtains stayed drawn longer, where the smell of starch and old letters never quite left the air. Inside those houses, the Great War never ended. It continued quietly, like a candle that refused to burn out, its flame small but obstinate, casting just enough light for a mother to remember the face that once leaned close to hers and said the simplest, most dangerous word in any language: goodbye. The earth keeps better records than people do. It remembers without ceremony, without the falseness of speeches, storing the truth in layers of clay and root and silence. Long after the parades faded and the flags folded themselves into attic dust, the fields of France continued their slow work of memory. Grass grew where wire once tangled, poppies burned red in the cracks of forgotten trenches, and beneath them the soil held everything: buttons, buckles, fragments of bone, all the small evidences of lives interrupted. At dawn the mist moved low, patient and white, curling around the crosses in the cemeteries like breath over mirrors. The caretakers arrived early, boots muffled on the damp paths, carrying tools and watering cans. They trimmed the hedges, brushed away leaves, and straightened the flags that had drooped overnight. To visitors it looked like devotion to the earth. It was cooperation. The living helped the ground look dignified, while the ground helped the living believe in peace. Each headstone stood identical in its humility, a geometry of grief that pleased the human eye. The names carved there were only the beginning. Below them stretched miles of silence. When it rained, the letters filled with water and shone briefly, like words learning to speak again. When the sun dried them, the brightness faded, but the indentations remained, proof that memory does not require attention, only permanence. Birds nested in the crevices of old bunkers. Vines climbed the walls where orders had once been shouted. The wind moved through the Argonne forest with the same indifference it had shown in 1918. Nature's forgiveness is not mercy, it is endurance. It covers everything, but it forgets nothing. Farmers still ploughed the battlefields. Their ploughs struck metal with a sound that no one ever got used to, the dull ring of iron meeting iron, the echo of a war note trapped in the earth. They called what they found the iron harvest: shells, helmets, canteens, sometimes entire rifles curled by rust into the shape of question marks. Some they turned into authorities, others they stacked at the edges of fields, monuments made by accident and patience. In certain places poppies grew thicker, almost feverishly, as if the soil itself were trying to bloom its way out of memory. Tourists came with cameras, careful not to step off the path, whispering to each other as though the dead were light sleepers. They took photographs of beauty, not realizing that beauty here was only distance dressed in color. The ground below them had no need for pity. It had already accepted everything. Sometimes, when the caretakers were alone, they said they could feel the ground breathing. It was not superstition, but observation. The air above the grass was warmer, softer, moving in small circles like a sigh. It was the earth releasing history in increments too gentle to be noticed by anyone in a hurry. Letters sent home from soldiers had described this soil as foreign, muddy, strange, heavy with rain, but to those buried in it, it became the most loyal homeland. The Atlantic could not separate them from the country they had left. It merely delayed the return. The mothers who had crossed to visit understood this before anyone else. They would kneel, touch the grass, and whisper the same word again and again, not goodbye, but home. On clear nights, the moonlight turned the rows of graves silver. The wind moved through them like a slow song, unbroken and low. Far away, trains passed, their faint vibrations reaching the surface and then descending into the layers below where thousands lay listening. If you stood still enough, you could almost believe the ground was speaking, a deep murmur, part wind, part memory, part forgiveness. The war had been human. The remembering belonged to the soil. It asked for nothing, gave everything, and would continue, century after century, to hold its charge, to keep safe what people could not bear to carry, to keep silent what language could never describe, and to make of every spring bloom not decoration but evidence that even from ruin life insists. Morning in the new decade no longer began with birdsong, it began with engines. Across America, factories awoke before the sun did, coughing smoke into the sky like giants clearing their throats, and the sound of hammers replaced the rhythm of hymns. The machine age had arrived, and with it came the illusion that speed could heal the soul. Men who had once dug trenches now dug foundations. They poured concrete, riveted steel, and learned to speak in the hard metallic syllables of progress. They wore goggles instead of helmets, gloves instead of bayonets. The tools in their hands were heavy and honest. They did not kill, they built. It was comforting to believe that motion was redemption, that if they could only keep moving forward, the ghosts would fall behind. Cities rose as if to outgrow memory. New York, once a harbor of immigrants and goodbyes, became a vertical dream, its skyline a forest of glass and ambition. Elevators climbed like prayers, and from the tops of buildings people looked down on the clouds, convinced that altitude was the same as peace. The newspapers called it modernity. The architects called it the future. The workers simply called it work. The radio, that new prophet of the air, spoke all day long in a calm voice that sounded wiser than any preacher. It sold automobiles, refrigerators, and hope in equal portions. Families gathered around it after dinner, listening to words that arrived without distance or delay. No one noticed how similar that voice was to the one that had once called men to enlist. The slogans were different, but the faith was the same. Trust the invisible, move forward, believe in the new. Airplanes stitched white seams across the blue sky, and the ground looked obedient from above. It was easy to imagine the world was healed when seen from so high. The same technology that had once dropped bombs now carried mail and passengers. The sky itself seemed to have forgiven humanity, but forgiveness, like silence, can be deceptive. In the rhythm of the machines there was a kind of prayer, steady, relentless, devoid of hesitation. The factories sang it in iron, the trains echoed it in rails, the automobiles hummed it down endless highways. Yet beneath the song of motion another tone persisted, the low hum of restlessness. Progress could fill the day, but it could not fill the night. The veterans, older now, stood on street corners watching a world that no longer resembled the one they had fought to save. The young spoke of profit, of stocks, of jazz and speed. To them, war was a photograph, sepia and heroic, hung in the hallway of history. The men who had lived it rarely corrected them. They smiled when spoken to and went home early, their hearts still tuned to a rhythm the machines could not drown out, the slow, deliberate beat of survival. Even in the countryside, the machines arrived. Tractors replaced horses, and fields that had once depended on weather now depended on fuel. The earth, ploughed by steel, gave back its harvest without the intimacy it once knew. The farmers became operators, the seasons became schedules, and the soil, remembering everything, said nothing. Art adapted to this new pulse. Painters drew angles and light instead of faces. Writers described cities the way priests once described heavens, vast, shimmering, and slightly terrifying. The old forms of prayer, kneeling, silence, humility, were replaced by the simple act of turning on a switch and watching the world obey. Yet progress, for all its noise, still left room for longing. On factory rooftops, in train stations at night, in the brief quiet after a machine stopped and before another began, people found themselves listening for something softer, a whistle in the distance, a remembered voice, the sound of wind through trees, the small, stubborn proof that humanity still existed underneath the metal skin it had built for itself. And somewhere in that balance between noise and quiet, America realized that it had built not just cities but momentum, a force that could not be slowed, only redirected. It did not know yet where it was heading, only that to stop would mean to feel again, and no one was quite ready for that. The machine age moved forward, beautiful and blind, its wheels gleaming under electric light, its heartbeat measured in rotations per minute. The world was faster, cleaner, louder, but beneath the hum of progress, if you listened carefully enough, you could still hear the faint rhythm of the drums from another century, pulsing beneath the pavement, reminding the living that every invention is also an echo. Fire never dies, it only hides. Beneath the quiet hum of the factories, under the applause of progress and the comfortable hum of radios, the embers of the last war smouldered patiently, waiting for breath. The machine age had given the world new miracles, but it had also given it new appetites, the kind that only power could feed. In Europe, the air was changing temperature. The treaties that had promised peace were beginning to feel like shackles, and the men who had signed them were growing old, their warnings fading into the noise of crowds. In Germany, the people were hungry again, not only for bread, but for meaning. They gathered in beer halls that smelled of smoke and bitterness, listening to a voice that sounded at first like anger, then like hope, and finally like command. The fire stirred. It whispered through flags raised under torchlight, through boots polished to a mirror shine, through the sharp rhythm of drums that promised order to a generation raised on chaos. In Italy, black shirts marched down ancient streets, calling it renewal. In Japan, generals looked toward the Pacific and saw not water but opportunity. And in every capital, diplomats sent telegrams written in the cautious language of denial, concerned but optimistic, regretful yet patient. The world wanted calm. The world got preparation. Factories that had once built tractors began, quietly, to build tanks. Shipyards that had rusted with peace began to echo with the sound of hammers again. Airfields multiplied across Europe like chessboards, and the planes were sleeker this time, faster, more beautiful, more deadly. Even the sky seemed to know what was coming. It learned to darken early, as though embarrassed by what it would soon have to witness. Across the Atlantic, America watched. It had its own distractions now. Skyscrapers scraping the clouds, radios singing, 1,000 inventions making daily life both easier and emptier. The stock market's fall had humbled the nation, but not enough to make it look outward. The lesson of the Great War had become a superstition that oceans could protect, that distance was destiny. Isolationism wrapped itself around the country like a quilt. Congress promised neutrality. Newspapers said Europe's quarrels were old, inherited, incurable. Parents told their children that America had already done its part for the world, and that the next generation would inherit only peace. The lie was kind and therefore believable, but the veterans saw what the others could not. They recognized the posture of pride, the sound of marching, the slow tightening of the world's pulse. They read the headlines and felt the same cold weight in their chests they had felt 20 years earlier. Some wrote letters to editors. Most said nothing. Memory had become impolite. And then, slowly the world began to speak in the old tongue again, the one of borders, armies, and destiny. Spain burned in civil war, and foreign powers tested their weapons under its skies as if rehearsing. In China, cities caught fire and did not stop burning. Refugees filled roads that seemed to lead in circles. The fire that had slept in the ashes of 1918 was stretching its limbs. America, meanwhile, tuned its radios to dance music. It bought new cars, built new suburbs, and celebrated the idea of normalcy. But even there, in the static between songs, sometimes you could hear the faint tremor of the world's heartbeat speeding up. In Washington, diplomats spoke of non-intervention, but the warehouses on the coasts began filling with steel and fuel. In factories, blueprints changed shape overnight. Some called it precaution, others prophecy. The fire was no longer sleeping. It was awake, walking quietly, its reflection flickering on the glass towers of a world that mistook brightness for safety. And one evening, as ships left harbour under grey skies and the Atlantic wind began to sharpen, the horizon itself seemed to shimmer, not with sunset but with the red pulse of something returning. The century was about to repeat itself. The world, having promised to remember, had learned instead how to forget. They were older now, grey at the temples, slower in their step, their medals kept in drawers that smelled of cedar and thyme, but when the second call came they recognized it immediately. It was not the words that haunted them, but the tone, the same solemn certainty, the same language of duty dressed up as destiny, the same drums beating beneath the speeches. The world, they thought, had learned nothing. The ghosts of 1918 stirred in every man who had once stood ankle-deep in the mud of France. They read the headlines in silence. Germany invades Poland. France mobilizes. Britain declares war. The print was sharper now, the ink darker, but the meaning was unchanged. A few veterans folded their newspapers and walked out into the morning light without speaking, afraid that if they did, their voices might betray the tremor of recognition. In towns across America, sons packed their bags again. The fathers helped them fold uniforms that were almost identical to the ones they had worn themselves. Same olive cloth, same brass buttons, same smell of starch and nerves. The mothers smiled bravely in doorways, the same way they had before, while the fathers stepped outside to light cigarettes and stare at nothing in particular. History, it seemed, was repeating not in words but in gestures. The veterans gathered again at their posts, the American Legion halls with faded flags and slow ceiling fans. They poured coffee that steamed like ghosts and argued softly about whether this new war would be different. Some said it had to be, others only stared into their cups. One man, whose hand still shook from the gas he had breathed in 1918, whispered that the world was simply a circle with sharper edges each time it turned. When the radios began broadcasting the sounds of Europe, the bombs, the sirens, the hurried voices, they listened the way men listen to an old wound aching in the rain. They could hear the shape of each sound, could tell which were shells, which were engines, which were men trying not to scream. Their wives turned down the volume. The men sat still, eyes unfocused, hearing not London or Warsaw but Belleau Wood and the Meuse Argonne. Some of them had sons who enlisted. They watched the boys march away and felt both pride and horror, emotions that refused to separate. At night they sat alone in kitchens lit by single bulbs, tracing the grain of the table with their fingers, remembering the last faces they had seen before mud closed over them. The thought that their children might see the same darkness again was almost unbearable, yet there was nothing to be done except to nod, to bless, to hope that this time the world meant it when it said, "Never again." In Europe, where the old trenches had become tourist paths, new ones were being dug not far away. The veterans who returned to visit their fallen comrades sometimes saw the new barbed wire glinting in the distance. They felt the earth shudder faintly under their boots, as if the soil itself were warning them. They would take off their hats, look toward the horizon, and whisper apologies to the ground. Back in America, the newspapers printed photographs of young men smiling from the decks of ships, and the veterans saw themselves, faces still soft, eyes too clear. They remembered that same departure, the band playing, the flags waving, the illusion that bravery could outpace destiny. The sight filled them with a tenderness so deep it felt like pain. When the first telegrams of casualties arrived, the old soldiers were the ones who understood how to knock on doors, how to remove their hats, how to speak gently. They delivered the messages because they knew what silence followed them. Each folded paper they handed over felt like a ghost made visible for a moment, hovering between one war and another. They began to appear at funerals again, standing in the back rows, their posture rigid, their eyes fixed on the flag covering the coffin. They saluted not only the dead but the memory of themselves. The young men they had been, now reflected in the young men who would never grow old. And at night, when the towns were quiet and the radio static hissed softly in living rooms, they felt the ghosts gather, not to haunt, but to remind. They came without sound, without judgment, as if to say that remembrance was a kind of truce, the only one humanity ever managed to keep. The veterans of 1918 had lived long enough to see the world forget them and then remember them too late. They had seen peace treated like a guest instead of a home, and as the fires of another war lit the sky overseas, they realized the truth that no sermon could soften. History does not repeat itself. It simply waits for witnesses. So, they stood once more in their doorways, watching the horizon burn faintly red, and thought of the fields in France where poppies still grew among the bones. The ghosts of 1918 were walking again, gentle but insistent, whispering through the night's still air the same lesson they had whispered a generation before, that memory is not enough to prevent a war, but forgetting is always enough to begin one. It was a Sunday morning, quiet and unhurried, the kind of morning that seems designed for forgetting. In kitchens across America, bacon hissed in pans, radios hummed soft music, and church bells drifted lazily through winter air. The country was half asleep in its own peace. The newspapers spoke of Europe's troubles as though they were fables from another continent. Tragic, yes, but distant, like thunder too far away to matter. Then came the sound. Not on the radios at first, not in the headlines, but in the sky above a harbour half a world away. The sound of engines that were meant to farm the clouds, now turned toward flame. Pearl Harbor was a name most Americans had never spoken before that morning. By nightfall, it belonged to everyone. Smoke rose against a blue Hawaiian sky so bright it seemed impossible that death could live in it. Battleships capsized like beasts rolling in pain. The ocean caught fire. The air filled with the smell of burning oil and salt, a mixture that would linger in the nostrils of a generation long after the wounds had closed. Back on the mainland, the news arrived like a hand across the face of a dream. Radios crackled, voices trembled, words stumbled. The United States of America, the announcer said slowly, has been attacked. In living rooms and barber shops and train stations, the phrase hung like thunder, refusing to fade. And just like that, the old sleep was over. Isolation, that comfortable fiction, shattered as cleanly as glass. The oceans that had once seemed like armor now looked like invitations. Men who had sworn their sons would never fight were silent. Women who had prayed to be spared felt their throats tighten with something fiercer than fear, a kind of purpose, terrible and undeniable. The same phrases returned, dusted off from 1917, honor, duty, sacrifice. Posters bloomed on every wall, flags unfurled on every porch, and the nation once again spoke in the solemn poetry of recruitment. The factories that had built cars built bombers instead. The fields that had grown corn grew silence. President Roosevelt's voice came over the radio, steady as a heartbeat. A date which will live in infamy, he called it, and the words landed like a seal on history's next chapter. Those who had been children in 1918 were men now, and they understood without needing to be told. The wheel had turned, the summons had come. In the weeks that followed, the trains filled again. Uniforms pressed, duffel bags slung over shoulders, mothers standing on platforms waving with the same tired bravery their mothers had once shown. The ghosts of 1918 walked among them, invisible but attentive, recognizing the ritual. The same farewells, the same trembling hands, the same false smiles meant to reassure. Across the Atlantic, old Europe heard America waking and exhaled a sigh that was part relief, part shame. The giant that had tried to sleep through the storm was rising again, its shadow stretching across oceans. The Allies called it salvation. The enemies called it interference. The truth, as always, was somewhere between necessity and destiny. For the veterans of the First War, it was a bitter resurrection. They stood in doorways watching the convoys pass, the young faces behind the glass too eager to understand the weight of what awaited them. Some saluted, others simply removed their hats. None believed it would be different this time, but all hoped to be wrong. On cold evenings, the newspapers carried photographs of Pearl Harbor's wreckage, ships half submerged, sailors' names printed in neat columns. The old men traced the lists with their fingers, as if touching the names could steady them. They recognized the pattern, the outrage, the speeches, the promises that this war too would end all wars. History had repeated its call, and America, faithful as ever, had answered. But beneath the resolve in the quiet corners of the country, the same unease returned, the knowledge that the world never truly learns, only begins again. Mothers sewed, fathers enlisted, children practiced air raid drills under classroom desks, and the radio played patriotic marches between reports of new losses. Somewhere, a young soldier packed his kit and tucked a photograph of his family into his pocket. On the back, someone had written, "Come home soon." He folded it carefully, the way another young man had folded a similar photograph in 1917, and slipped it near his heart. The trains departed at night. The whistles echoed across the plains, fading into darkness. America was awake now, fully, painfully, gloriously awake. The second summoning had been heard. The world had asked again, and the answer, once more, was yes. And somewhere in that vast chorus of engines and footsteps and vows, a quiet echo could be heard, so faint that only the ghosts noticed it. The soft, resigned murmur of those who had once believed that the last time had truly been the last. The war ended again, as wars always do, suddenly for some, slowly for others, and never completely for those who had seen it. Cities burned, oceans darkened, and when the smoke lifted, the world looked new only because the ruins had changed their shape. Flags were folded, treaties signed, and nations stood before the mirror of victory, trying not to notice what they had become while they were winning. Across America, the soldiers came home once more. The trains arrived in every station, the brass bands struck up the same brave songs, and the crowds waved until their arms ached. The faces behind the glass were younger this time, the uniforms cleaner, but the eyes were the same. They had seen the same horizon, felt the same weight of waiting for a bullet that did not yet have their name on it, and now they were returning to a country that greeted them with gratitude and unease in equal measure. The newspapers called it the dawn of a new era. The old soldiers smiled and said nothing. They had seen too many dawns to mistake light for peace. In quiet towns, the cemeteries expanded again. New rows of crosses appeared beside the old ones. The years etched into the marble like chapters in a book that refused to end. Mothers who had survived one war learned to speak the language of grief a second time, their hands steady from practice. The churches filled with prayers that sounded tired of being prayers, and the bells tolled with the weary dignity of men, repeating an oath they no longer believed could be kept. The veterans of 1918 and 1945 sometimes met by chance in post offices, in barber chairs, in the shade of courthouse lawns. They looked at each other, as one might look into a mirror angled slightly into the past. One had fought in the mud, the other in the air. One had known horses, the other engines. But beneath the uniforms, beneath the years, they were the same men, two versions of the same confession, spoken decades apart. The younger asked what it had been like back then. The older smiled sadly and said, "It was like now." The circle had closed. The promises made after the First War, to remember, to rebuild, to never repeat, had worn thin in the noise of progress. The world had become faster again, louder again, more confident in its machines, more fragile in its soul. History, patient and amused, had simply waited for the right silence to enter. America had changed, but perhaps not in the way it had hoped. It was stronger, richer, and everywhere awake, but in its heart there was a hum it could not name. The vibration of memory beneath the highways, the whisper of fields in France beneath new wheat, the slow breathing of oceans that had carried its sons to war twice in one lifetime. The nation had learned to build anything except forgetfulness that lasted. At night, the veterans sat on their porches listening to the wind move through the trees. The sound was the same as it had been on the Western Front. Leaves whispering like faraway shells, the air tasting faintly of rain and metal. Some of them closed their eyes and thought of the men who had never come home, of the letters half written, of the faces that existed only in photographs now fading into sepia. They did not curse history for repeating itself. They simply accepted that memory, like gravity, could not be escaped. And somewhere, in the great vault of time, the ghosts of both wars met each other. They recognized one another instantly, not by faces but by silence. They walked together through the fields that had once been trenches, under skies that had learned to heal themselves. They said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The century moved on. New wars would come, smaller perhaps, but carrying the same familiar heartbeat. New soldiers would march, new flags would rise, and old stories would be told again under new names. The circle once drawn cannot be erased. It only widens until it includes everyone. But somewhere in the quiet spaces, in the pause between radio static, in the hum of a distant train, in the flicker of a candle on Memorial Day, the truth still speaks softly. That peace is not the opposite of war, but the brief moment in which humanity remembers what it costs. And so the circle closes, not as punishment, but as reminder. The soil still breathes. The oceans still listen. The living still promise. And the dead, patient as always, still wait for the world to mean it when it says never again. Every century ends the same way, not with applause, nor even with relief, but with a deep collective exhale. It is the sound of the world remembering what it tried to forget. For America, that exhale came softly, drawn out over years, disguised as ordinary life. The factories kept running, the children kept growing, and the seasons did what seasons always do. They turned. But beneath all that movement, under the paved streets and telephone wires and humming lights, there was still the faint pulse of the past. You could feel it if you stood still long enough. The earth remembered every footstep, every echo of marching, every promise that began with hope and ended with silence. Sometimes, late at night, the wind that moves through the cornfields sounds almost like waves breaking against a ship's hull. Sometimes, in the dim corridors of museums, the air smells faintly of oil and paper and rain, the scent of uniforms long put away. Sometimes, in the half-light of dawn, when the radio has not yet started, and the world feels uncertain again, a man waking from sleep will hear a noise that does not exist. A faraway whistle, a roll of thunder, a voice calling his name, and he will understand, just for a second, that history never truly leaves us. It only grows quiet when we stop listening. The soil has kept its word. It has taken in what we could not bear, held it gently, and turned it into something green again. The oceans, too, have forgiven us, though they have not forgotten. They still rise and fall over the bones of ships and men, whispering their names to the stars each night. The wind that crosses the Atlantic carries all of it. The prayers, the letters, the unfinished goodbyes, blending them into a single sound that is neither grief nor glory, but something older and truer remembrance. America, for all its power, remains a nation of listeners. It listens to its ghosts, though it rarely admits it. They are there, in the cadence of speeches, in the pauses between fireworks on the 4th of July, in the way a veteran's hand trembles when the national anthem plays. Every generation thinks it has outgrown them, yet every generation hears them again when the drums begin. The young will always believe that courage can save them. The old will always know that memory is the only thing that can between them. Lies the fragile thread that holds the world together, the belief that understanding the past is the closest thing we have to peace. And so the circle remains, not as a prison, but as a promise that the soil will keep remembering even when we do not, that the dead will keep teaching even when we refuse to learn, and that somewhere, in the hush between wars, there will always be a voice, quiet, patient, almost kind, reminding us that history is not gone. It is only waiting to be heard again.